API Resilience Podcast. It's our belief that APIs are central in the changing business landscape that has been named digital transformation, and that digital transformation through APIs offers the opportunity for a dramatic shift in how companies can work together and participate in creating value. We've invited guests from many different types of organizations and asked them to share insights from their journeys and their API programs, as well as the challenges, objectives, and approaches as they endeavor to make their companies and communities more resilient.
A system is either resilient or it's not, or it has levels of resiliency and that it can be resilient in the face of certain failures. But ultimately, you can't say this is the level 15 of resiliency. There's no way to really quantify that. But if you continue to stretch the system, and the only way that you can figure out when you've gone too far is when it blows up in your face. If I give you the ability to just immediately know whether or not you can do something without having to think, that's really paradigm shifting.
Welcome to the API Resilience Podcast. Today we've got Michael Hibay, who's an API evangelist, architect, and the CTO at Vesti Social. For the last 10 years, he's been helping a lot of organizations in a variety of industries to establish, correct, and evolve and mature their API platforms and strategies. And it's always good to talk with another systems thinker. So welcome, Michael.
It's great to be here.
So I think I got here, so I'm a bioengineer by education. And I think this has been kind of how we got with our business where we are today, which is like cultivating, mostly community, like being part of community, building community. Until we found like this niche where it's like, okay, now things are really working. And there was dev portals for us 5 years ago. Really started like that. That was a whole different game. But like in terms of how we work with our colleagues. So for me, in order of priorities, first the people, then the customers, and then profit. And I'll sacrifice profit any day to make sure that people and customers are good. Of course, we need profits. It still is a business, but yeah. And so this is really, really a long-term perspective. And we've always been like that. And then I start reading about systems theory and all that good stuff. It just more and more is like, yes, all this.
Yes, so there's so much that, and I'm kind of nodding obviously with this, and it's that the over competition, right? Competition is good in its own right because it prevents stagnation, but it's like this thought of over competition, like competing to kind of provide a similar capability and all that stuff like that spurs innovation, right? Because it's like, okay, well, there's a healthy level of that, right? But then there's like this destructive level where it's like, okay, well, now I've switched over to, I believe that there's like a finite set that I have to fight for, versus, almost like a rivalry versus, it's friendly rivalry, right? That's good, right? But like when you're trying to eliminate the competition, right? You've turned over in this toxic leaf, and you're gonna have a negative tailspin in the entire ecosystem by kind of making that the mentality happen. Money and profits are they're water, they flow, right? But even if you get money and then you spend the money, right, or you get the money and you give it to investors or whatever, you still didn't destroy the money. You just moved it. It's like energy. You just move that around in the system, right? Like if you sacrifice your people, if you sacrifice your relationship with your customers, you've gotten rid of something tangible. Like the money will continue to flow, whether it flows to you or not, right? Like that's if you have the customers and the people to be able to kind of continue to provide something that will direct money your way. And it's such a short-term thing to kind of say, hey, profits above everything else. Yeah, we're going to get rid of our people. We're going to fire our customers and all that kind of stuff. Like it's such short-term thinking where you just don't even realize that you're literally killing the goose that lays the golden egg.
Yeah. So I'm nodding vigorously, because we won't have video on the recording. But yeah, exactly. And it's not bad or good. It's not binary. It's a complex surface with all kinds of different niches. And, you need people that are doing more competition and less collaboration, and you need people that are hyper collaborative and that don't really compete. So you need all of that diversity, because I think it's important to keep our economy healthy. But it's this over-glorification of winning at all costs that I think is the...
Well, not just that, but I'm not sure if a monoculture almost scares me more as a person, right? Like if there's nothing new for me to learn, nothing new for me to experience or to grow from and hear and meet new people and of new backgrounds and new things, I that sounds scary to me. And I'm not sure what I would do with
dangerous. My time. It's boring and dangerous, because this was something that we've talked about in previous episodes with then co-host Mark Winberry, is this whole just-in-time delivery supply chains. It took all the slack out of the system, and now we've got this hyper fragile thing where there's one ship stuck in the stupid channel and the whole economy is in ruins, which is insane. It's just insane.
Yeah. It really is. I mean, it shows how the quantitative and the qualitative, the tension between those two kind of things, and the way that you're looking at the data that you're seeing, right, allows you to tell yourself a story and eventually convince yourself of the truth of, well, if I can't quantify it, it doesn't exist, right? Yeah. What is slack? What is the leniency? How do you really quantify the ability for a system to be resilient? Well, you really can't, but that doesn't mean it's not true. Right? Like a system is either resilient or it's not, or it has levels of resiliency, and that it can be resilient in the face of certain failures or perturbations. But ultimately, you can't say that this is the level 15 of resiliency. It doesn't have that. There's no way to really quantify that. But
interesting,
if you continue to stretch the system, right, towards the data, towards the things, towards being able to support one particular efficiency in one particular domain, right? Yeah. Then, for profits, right? So then something else is getting that tension. Something else is picking up that slack, and all you're doing is you're removing the slack and the tension from different parts of the system that you don't understand.
Yes.
And the only way that you can figure out when you've gone too far is when it blows up in your face.
Yes. And we have this all over the place. We've been doing this now. We have it in climate change. We've got it in our soils. We've got it in our healthcare. We've got it all over the place. This naive over-optimization that actually is hurting us now and is making us less optimized. So not only have we gotten rid of resilience, now we're actually getting into the territory where we're spending more money to be worse off. And we're repeating this over and over and over again. And it doesn't mean that we have to just throw away our technology. No, not at all. But just we need to become smarter. We need to start understanding systems. And I think this is and here we come segue to the API space. I think this is what partially APIs are about, I think, or could be about, or at least it's a prerequisite of being successful with APIs, I think. And this is why I got really excited when I saw your tweet. We were talking about affordance catalogs rather than API catalogs or service catalogs. So I heard the word affordances mentioned in API space the first time, I think it was at API days. I was like, I don't understand this. So it must be interesting. So started digging a little bit deeper. Still don't think I fully understand it. So it's this word that doesn't fit in your head somehow, or at least for me. I don't know if you have the same thing. So can you maybe explain what does the word affordances mean for you, and how do you see that in the context of APIs?
So I'm not sure I fully understand it yet, but I've been on this vein for a while. when you look at affordances in the context of APIs, it's really stepping back and looking at describing a system and what the capabilities are. And there's subtle differences depending on how you use the language. But for me, affordances are really the capability to do something, right? The affordances is that you intuitively, without extra thought, without tons of extra processing, know that you can perform some action or do something. Um, because of the context of things around you. And the example of the door, well, the door has an affordance because I see a doorknob. I know that I can turn and open that door, right? Like that's just one of those things that now I have been taught that seeing that affords the ability to open, right? Like that is the affordance, is the thing that I intuitively know in the environment around me that I have the capability to do things. And sometimes when I explain this, a lot of times people will come and say, well, what's the difference between like action or capability in the API space? And I kind of liken this to voltage. Affordance
Mhm.
isn't actually an action. Right? It's not actually a capability. It's the potential for that capability.
It's like magic. It's
Yeah.
technology that has become sufficiently advanced that you don't even
Yes.
see it anymore.
Hmm.
Okay, interesting. One of the things I've realized is that like user experience is one of those areas that's very, very close to this, where because it's kind of like it's evolving. It's evolving together with humanity. Like as our understanding and enough people's understanding grows about what certain things mean, you can make better use of it without like it becomes an affordance actually in that perspective. Okay, very cool.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I'm using the previous kind of conversation examples. The data world, we have so much data, so much information and such, but it doesn't give us any affordance because we still need to mine the data. We still need to put it together. We need to put a story together and a meaning. We need to extract a story and meaning from that data before we can do anything with it, right? The affordance is the explicit and immediate understanding of I have the ability to do something, right, without work to figure out whether I have that capability to do it or not. And it's a subtle distinction, but it has everything to do with how you perceive the system, right, and how usable that system will be. And usable is a really good tie in there for useful integrations, direct point integrations, whether I call it an API or a service or a web service or, a service bus or whatever paradigm you want, have largely existed for a long time. Having computers talk to each other, like that paradigm doesn't change. You can always do that. But if I give you the ability to just immediately know whether or not you can do something without having to think, without having to create a back and forth, a dialogue, that's really paradigm shifting. That's really going to change the game because now you can really speak with a digital system much the same way that you do with the environment around you or with people around you, right? It really humanizes, right, and really brings together the digital systems closer to the human experience, and allows them to be far more useful.
This is also not just APIs then. This is any kind of interface.
That the concept really truly is, like you said, from a user experience perspective, part of that. And one of
Yeah.
the things that I've said for a while, and many people have said, is that the API is your user experience. And I think one of my earlier blog posts was really, regardless of having an app or a UI, your API is the core of your user experience. And the reason is because the affordance starts with the system that knows what's available or not and can tell those other different experiences whether or not this capability exists.
Very cool. One book that changed my worldview was Neither Ghost Nor Machine. It talks about constraints, how basically living systems are constraints on constraint on constraints, that by having all these constraints together turn into affordances that allow us to perform work. It's again, it's in the same space. It's so abstract, so far away from our daily experience, but it has that same, like, it disconnects with it.
Well, so I thought that there's a very interesting thing there. I think this has been one of the things that I've struggled along with to kind of really wrap my head around this. And the knowledge and the realization really kind of came when I came around full circle on the thinking on that. And humans are wonderful summary machines. We build habits and then we forget that we've built them, right? We are in some ways a giant machine learning algorithm walking around in a human suit, and we kind of forget all of those things that we learned before, or all the blocks that we built our knowledge on from the start. It's the subconscious experience of learning that we do, where we build these pathways where we don't have to think about it again, that really performs this work on the affordance. And it's so different from our normal cognitive experience on a day-to-day basis, because we don't actually spend our conscious thinking on creating and understanding like these affordances in the system around us from a constraints perspective. But it's very, very inherent and native to the way that we as humans operate. It's just we don't do it consciously. It's the subconscious part of our brain that performs this function for us. I understand the constraint of gravity implicitly, but I don't think about it. I just know, right? Gravity is now an affordance. I know if I throw something up, it's going to come down. And I know a pretty good idea, how well that's going to come down. And if you get really good at that affordance, you've got great intuition on it, somebody will pay you to be an outfielder in baseball. I mean, a lot of money. So it's about understanding these affordances, right, and developing those intuitions about it. It is very much our normal process. It's just the subconscious part, and the difficulty is really in getting your conscious pathways, your conscious thinking, really involved in that process as well. Like understanding that actually, no, you're a very explicit engine, right? Your brain is a very explicit thing, but you've created these neural pathways that whether or not you've labeled it consciously, you don't know. You may not be aware, but you definitely have in your brain, and that's how the process works. And it's really about affordance is about getting that kind of cognitive connection with digital systems and bringing that explicitly to creating these understandings so that you can interact with a digital system in a lot of ways.
But then building an affordance catalog is about more than just publishing a list of affordances. It's about a lot more. It's about changing your culture, education programs. It's all of that together. The affordance has to be built both in the system and in the minds of the people that are going to be using the affordances.
And that's the key. It is not a technical solution. It's a socio-technical solution. And that's that's one of the big differences between the ideas behind an affordance catalog and an API or service catalog, because either of those other options are ultimately going to devolve to be, this is the technical answer.
Here's the
right?
docs. Yeah.
Right. It creates this false dichotomy between the tech and the business, whatever the business is. And it exacerbates it. And over time, it becomes the wedge, because it's not truly the ubiquitous language. And it's very difficult to be explicit. But if you kind of look and figure out what you do on a daily basis and the conversations that you have, you understand that your brain kind of puts more information into a context to kind of fill in the gaps so that you can understand, right, and be comfortable and aware with the ambiguity, talk to other people. But if you really dive in, run a lot of event storming and other kind of sessions, and when you really dive into what people think they're saying when they say the same words, you have extremely divergent definitions, and the meanings are all over the place. There's some agreement, but mostly not agreement. But everybody was like, yeah, we totally are saying the same thing. Same words, not same meaning.
Yeah.
So the difficulty is really in, and the beauty is in building these affordances in these languages, is to really be explicit about something that we're as humans, comfortable with filling in the gaps enough to be functional, right? But not enough to where a digital system can function on it. And the Affordance Catalog is really like, let's fill that gap in to get to the point where the humans in the system and the system itself can understand at the same level what's happening in that one there. Because now I can have a ton of more humans involved in conversations about the technical system aspects, because the system is truly aligned with the same definition and worldview of the people who are operating the socio side of it.
You said something that there are gaps. And I guess, why do we need the gaps? Is it because they allow for creativity?
Well, we need and have the gaps, and I'm not sure if they're entirely orthogonal, but gaps really do in a lot of other contexts afford creativity. So I'm not sure that I could either say yes or no.
This book I mentioned, they talk about the gap as actually the thing that is alive, where the life actually happens.
Yes.
So there's a bunch of constraints that create a space, but you are never going to describe exactly what is happening in that space. So you have all these, you can only direct it so that it doesn't stop. So you try to create an infinite game by creating the right constraints that prevent the game from ending.
Exactly.
So probably this is something similar.
Defining an affordance catalog is a constant process of evolving a language. And just like human languages, and that's really what it is. It's creating a specific and explicit, you could even say almost like jargon, if you will, for a company and industry, whatever the space is that you're creating this language for, that is the truth of how that communication is. And I can't possibly know what's going to happen in the future, right? And I know that what happened in the past doesn't serve me now. The ultimate truth in this process is that these languages are living things, but they're things that have to absolutely be defined, right? Like you were saying, the Dutch word, right, with palette and the cognate with English, palette. Okay, cool. We have these translations and such, but we're very explicit, even if it's dynamic and changes over time, malleable, right? We're very explicit about what our language definition and rules are, right? Like you can't just send me a list of all of the Dutch words and I will know what it is, right? No, because there's more rules, there's more constraints to it, right? That make it just from a set of words to a language. The same is true in our systems. You need to actually build and evolve this language, and they have to be explicit about it.
The thing is, though, that the language is constrained by the people that need to learn it. So a lot of the constraints that languages have are in our heads, and we don't even know what those constraints are.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's probably, then that means that an affordance catalog for your interface program of your organization, where you're trying to publish an affordance catalog to get both your internal and your external participants to collaborate with you, needs to co-evolve together with the audience that is using it.
Absolutely. Yep. Any other way is fraught with failure. It cannot be successful.
How would you do this practically? So there's like the whole API design first school of thought that is going in this direction somewhat, but it's assuming that you know what you want ahead of time. And with affordance, like with this kind of stuff, you don't know, because it's a living system and it's going to be evolving.
It's going to be evolving. It's about incremental, right? It's not trying to have a full solution at the end of time, right? And fortunately, with interfaces and APIs, right, you have the fallback of you can fall to something like a CRUD model, right? You have a certain level of API where if you need, right, and you absolutely have no affordance or capability that does what you need, you can fall back to this other more lower in the details, right, kind of model to kind of make sure you can get what's done. Maybe that's the gap, right? And maybe that's where the churning is happening. A lot of the churn is happening here in redefining. But the affordance level is where you kind of you got the stuff that you know, right? And the process about co-evolving this language is like when you've figured out what these things are that they know, right? You create a definition of this concept, right? And this is kind of dry at the very highest level, right? What it is a conceptual model. It's got nothing to do with your implementation or where you're storing it. It's everything about like once you've defined something, use that definition, right? This is once you've defined your language. Yeah, it's hard. It takes a lot of work. It is not a simple process to do this, but once you have it, it's gold. Use it, right? Like use this catalog of your affordance, because otherwise you're constantly redefining and just expecting people to go from being able to be intuitively aware of what they want to accomplish and how it interacts with this system, right? To this place where we aren't intuitively aware and we need to figure it out. We need to have meetings and all this kind of stuff like that. And computers aren't going to have those conversations with people, right? Like it can't happen. So it creates this huge bottleneck in this process where when we're trying to create something new, it's extremely valuable, right? To have that churn and that dialogue, right? That's definitely not waste. But when we're saying, hey, the N+1 50,000th person to implement a checkout flow, at some point now we're really just wasting time in this process, because really that is well defined already, and it should be something that falls more into an affordance realm versus into the area where innovation and churn is truly happening, where we're defining new things.
I think one of the key dualities that I've been doing a lot of thinking about is the duality of service and product. Where should you?
What do you mean service there? Can I ask?
I'll explain. So we're right now we're mostly service company. We have some product, or we have a product that accelerates our services, and pretty much everybody you talk with in the startup world, they're like, you have to get rid of the service part because that's not scalable. You need to be in a product business. And I think I just got a new way of looking at products. Basically, products are affordances, or should become affordances, because when something has been done enough times, you shouldn't be reinventing it anymore. So when the global consensus, or a large enough consensus starts building up in this complex adaptive society that we're part of, then at some inflection points, we need to say like, okay, this now really needs to be a product because it needs to become an affordance. So actually that is connected with that, I guess.
That's a very interesting thought. I don't think I've looked at it very much that way, but I see a strong correlation there between the concepts. It's this affordance is something where it's defined enough where it should be consistent across any alternative, right? If I go through web checkout company A, web checkout company B, web checkout company Z, it really shouldn't be fundamentally different, right? The concepts of the domain and what you're trying to accomplish in that way are the same. You really truly should be competing on other things, not the definition of what your flow is, but really like, the ability, the costs to apply that, like, different service level agreements, there's many other factors you would have competition between those products on in that realm. But defining a unique API for each one of those is kind of really the same problem, one level higher than we're talking about what created the API movement in itself, right? If you go for the same approach, but just elevate the level of abstraction one higher, you're going to run into all of the same problems that you ran into before, right? The approach is what has to change. So you want to, and you have wonderful things like open banking, which is a great example of this, like this understanding that the way that we do an API is not our product. It's not what the bank is the product, right? The API is how we talk about banking. The API is the communications of it. That's bringing the almost commodity conversation into it, where this is how you talk to a bank digitally. And, the product is really just the thing that speaks it, right? Like, and that's the thing that you're selling. It's no longer the service of figuring out how to do and build a web bank or a web API for a bank and how you should organize it. It's your product is the system that you have that does that. Socio-technical system.
But that means that this is as much a battle, like, so, oh, and I'm talking battle language now, which is very competitive, but this is as much a battle for minds as it is about technology. It means that's like, well, it's kind of like with standards. It's always been like that. You have a set of players that need to come to agreements so that you can get a large enough aisle of standardization that creates a large enough population that is sharing the connectors for the affordances that you've built.
I really like the language metaphor for a whole lot of reasons.
Yes.
Basically, because of the way it's done, and it really is a language and a communication. But the language metaphor itself kind of helps teach it. I can build a product that speaks multiple languages, and that's kind of the key. Like all of a sudden, when you realize that the Affordance Catalog is not tied to the actual implementation, if you're worried about what your resource structure looks like or whatever stuff, then you can't speak multiple languages with that API, right? The only way you can speak multiple languages is have multiple versions of the system. And that doesn't work because now you have multiple versions. You've projected out to the world the fact that you don't have a single interface, you have many interfaces. And now they're responsible for piecing all that together. The languages, I can have a system that speaks multiple languages. Right. Just like, you were speaking Dutch, I'm sure, earlier today, and now you're speaking English, right? You haven't changed. They didn't release a new version of Kristof, but it's still you, but you're speaking a different language, same product, different way to communicate with it. The big thing is that with a standards approach and a data-centric approach from a systems level, you have almost a contention between trying to find the entire audience of ever who would ever know and all of the use cases of ever, right? Like there's so many ontological surveys which are still 30 years out, still going. It's an infinite problem and you can never complete it. You can't figure it out. And that's really the problem that when you get into the standards approach, you kind of often run into is that you can never be sure that you're addressing everybody's use case, right? And eventually you have to draw a line somewhere and somebody's always mad. Well, it's because it requires you to gather all of the knowledge first before you can start. And that at a data-centric level, if you're specifying it to that degree, instead of making that a dynamic thing, if you're trying to make that concrete and where you're standardizing, you're always going to run into this problem. Whereas if you flip this on its head and say that will be something that follows the form of the language, right? Or that kind of comes down into it from the language. You start with defining the concepts and terms first and allow those to come later, right? You can have those be negotiable, like HTTP, right? So many things are negotiable, right? They didn't know that HTTP 3 was going to come and gRPC and all these other things that it was able to support because they made that a negotiable element that the two people talking could say, yeah, I can do that. Yeah, you can do that. Cool. All right, we'll do that. The language metaphor allows you to kind of really get to the core of the concepts without worrying about those details.
Because even in language, words are not defined because there is no absolute definition of any single word. Even dictionaries have multiple definitions of a word, and they change because people start using them differently and they evolve. So it's very similar.
The context and the language is great. And like that one little thing that kind of really, this was a huge watershed moment. But when I realized this is that the difference is that the context in our conversations is what allows us to pick out which definition that person means.
Yes.
So we have a lot of other knowledge and context and we say, I know exactly which word you have there, right? Well, in REST, we say, self-descriptive messages. Well, what does that mean? It means everything that was there in the message in the context so that I know which definition of the word there you meant, right? I knew which word it was. So all of that information was there. I was explicit, even though the word there may be ambiguous. I was explicit in all of the communication so that you knew exactly which one it was. And despite there being ambiguities in the language, I'm pointing at it with all of that context and all that information. I'm pointing at exactly which one I'm speaking, and you understand it because it's explicit, even if I didn't say
Mhm.
this is the definition on page 52 of Webster's.
Let's change tack a little bit. How do you go
Sure.
about because you're building an affordance catalog in your job? How do you go about that? What are the projects that you're doing to achieve that outcome? Like, what are your increments that you're doing to get there?
From an Affordance Catalog perspective, well, there's
Mhm.
a lot of background. There's a lot of things here. It may be easier to kind of talk about what was going on kind of before. So in general, people are familiar and aware of kind of API governance and service governance, right? Like this is kind of paradigms that people are familiar with. And in a lot of ways, the process of managing change in API and service governance is more or less the same process that you talk about with affordance governance. And the process of initiating a conversation about affordance is similar, but dependent upon the concept of similar to like API first kind of design methods, right? You have no code first. It's very similar in that regard, but the conversations that you're having in that first effort, because it'll probably take a while, it usually does. What you're talking about is the very painful process of the first couple times you do it of actually being explicit about what things mean. And it's really, you go through this event storming session and you talk about, and you put up like you have behind you on the post-it boards, like you put up post-its and you go through processes that allow you to literally just define the things that you're talking about, right? And the things that things can do, right,
Mhm.
in the domain, and then identifying the different perspectives of or family perspectives of a system that allow that have a shared view or a very similar view of what things are. An order in a logistics, e-commerce company, an order from the logistics division is going to look very different from the order in the support, perspective. It may be the same order, but the things you care about are very different from those perspectives. So you get an understanding of these perspectives. You get an understanding of the kind of things that are very high level involved in this system, and you get a high level understanding of the things that either people or those things do within this system, right? And I don't mean technical things. I mean like your whole process. Just, it doesn't matter if it's digital or human based. You just,
Mhm.
that's it. And it seems like it's a bit of a cop out, but once you actually have that down and you have everybody have an understanding of what these words mean and what they do, you've eliminated like 85% of the bike shedding conversations you'll have in those API design conversations later, because you've already said what you've already defined your source of truth on what from a design perspective is. And so there isn't much kind of question about where does this property go. It's what is that thing a property of, right? We've already defined the thing. Which is it? Right? And if you don't have a good conversation, right, now you're in that iteration perspective. Well, we found a new thing. We found a new thing that we need to define. Now let's go have that conversation to figure it out. What is this thing?
But this assumes that you can bring everybody whose mind is helping to define it into a single room and to collaborate. But when you're talking about exposing affordances or APIs to like the wider public, that's never going to happen. How do you go about that? Like you basically you define them with a smaller group and then you try to change the minds. That's how it works.
It's more of an on-ramp than anything else. So there was a little bit of an assumption in there that I kind of want to call out, and it was one that I tripped on for a while, and that is you're never going to be able to get everybody in the room. The assumption underlying that is just that you have a high cost of iteration
Mhm.
of this definition, right? And consistency, because I'm going to version my API. And ultimately, it goes back to I'm going to version my API. So getting people to move from one version to the next is expensive. So I have to worry about making sure I get it right the first time so that I don't do that. And it's a kind of a long chain of reasoning to get to. But when you have a versionless API that is truly driven by affordances, the process of adding new affordances, right, is it's non-breaking. You can't break anybody by adding a new capability they don't know about, right? They are constantly discovering what these new affordances are. If it doesn't work, or they say something is like this or it's incorrect, that's something that you can really dynamically kind of apply. And since you're not defining it based on your operational API, right, it's decoupled, you get the same ability to like A/B test or put things in and take things out very quickly. You're not tied to that same cost life cycle where we're going to impede and I have to get it right the first time. By decoupling the definition process and the operations API, the way things work out when you code to it, you actually can iterate quickly independently and over time gather more feedback.
My brain is fried by now. This has been like serious concept gymnastics. I've learned a lot. There's some really interesting avenues that are opening up. I need some time to process it, and I want to talk again with you.
Sure, I'd love to. This was a lot of fun too, and clearly we can't stop talking because find this very interesting. Everything you're bringing up, so we'll have to plan some more other time to talk then. I would love to have more conversations like this in the future if you're open. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, let's do that.
It's our hope that you were encouraged by today's story and picked up some insights that will help you navigate your digital transformation and make your API program more successful. If you have questions or feedback on the podcast, we invite you to email us at info@pronovix.com. Thanks for listening.